Okay, so we're going to do a wet on wet, and I'm going to show you a great little cheater that I like to use. I learned from Linda Kemp. She's a phenomenal acrylic and watercolor painter. She was primarily known for watercolors, but then switched over to acrylic and has her own kind of really cool style of paint. But in just the last couple of years, she's got back into watercolor, doing watercolor classes. So this here was worth the price of admission. As I said, I never stop going and learning myself. There's always something to be learned from one another as we go along this watercolor journey. It's just phenomenal. But this here is so much fun. No taping involved. I barely even use, like I said, I haven't used tape in a long while anyway because I tend to work wet on dry for most of my projects. However, I do enjoy doing a wet on wet every now and again. So what we're going to do is, I just did kind of like a little bit of a quick little horizon line. Use that Bien Fang, that older one I had, that 90-pound cold press, but it's got a really nice textural rough surface. It's a little bit off on the camera's making it look really yellow, but you know which one it is. That's the Bien Fang that I talked about, and I think I wrote it on there in pencil. So I'm going to get a nice wet brush, and I'm going to turn that over, and I actually had folded it because I was going to do it in two. But see, when you first start, it's going to kind of puddle, and that's because of the sizing. Remember we talked about that? It's going to puddle on the surface. The sizing is there so that it doesn't absorb into the paper. Well, the more water we add and the more we brush that water in, it removes the sizing and it becomes more absorbent. So we want to make this back paper. You can see it's starting to get wet. That's why I wanted to do the 90-pound. The 140 and up, it takes much more effort to get it wet. But for this purposes, to show you the wet on wet, the 90-pound is what I'm going to use only for speed purposes. But I typically would just use a 140. So see how that's already starting to buckle? That's really nice and wet. Now you're going to flip it over. You know that gator board? Take that and get another wet, put it on here, and now you're going to wet the top. And as that top becomes wet, it's going to glue it down. It's going to just smack it right down onto that surface. And just be liberal with the water here and make sure it's all over. You want a really nice glisten. You want it nice and wet. And if you see some areas once you've got this paper fully wet and you see a couple of little bubbled areas, that's easy enough to do too. You just lift the corner up. That just means that underneath here it's not wet enough, and then you just take it and bring it down. Okay, once again, there's a little area there. Just take that corner, lift it up. I see a little dry spot, a bubble. You can put it on the water underneath the paper there, or just even put it on the surface and come down again and come over the surface. So here we are, nice and wet, right? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little quickie landscape, I guess. I just did a little horizon line there, so maybe I'll do like a wintry. I'm not sure why I'm into the winter. So dab that off. We're going to kind of come into a color here. I want to do a really light wash. Oh geez, I just messed up my... See, that happens, right? It happened right on camera. So that happens, right? So that's why haste makes waste. I'm going to come in, I'm going to absorb that right up to get rid of that color. Remember I was talking about dirtying your colors. You don't want to mix in with your pigment palette. Have a separate palette. Don't use your paper really, honestly. Remember I was saying some people will mix their colors right on the paper, but it tends to be a little duller. So right now, here's the wet on wet. I'm going to do a wash. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a graduated here. So you're going to do a combination wet on wet and a graduated. So I'm going to bring that color down. And as I bring it down, it's going to be less because you're adding more water, right? So I'm just going to bring a little bit more on the top. Right? Take off that excess and then just pull it down. So you kind of got this. So you can even go straight off the paper too. And you can always blot that up. So it doesn't, especially if you're going to be using other colors. and it won't pollute it. It's okay though, don't worry about it. I had a crease in there, so you're going to see that line right in the middle. So there we go. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take I think it's gonna oh, well, it's a pretty small piece of paper, so maybe I'll just take that number 6, you know, the number 6 that we have. I still have some green here. I want to make it a little bit darker, so I'm gonna add a little bit more blue to it, make it more of an evergreen color. See that? That was that wash that I've had in the previous. Still going a long way, huh? And I'm just gonna, it's not my favorite paper, but you can see how amazing that, see how that blooms out like that? Right? And then I can even come in with that darker wash. Remember that darker, cooler wash? The core of the tree. Right? I'm going to water that down a little bit, because remember, the further in the distance, the lighter, or the further away. Yeah, that's pretty yellow, isn't it? Let's add a little. Let's see how that just spreads. I'm going to kind of give some wintry kind of a look here. I'm going to use a cool, right? Remember we said cool blue is a great blue for winter colors. I'm just going to dilute a little bit, because I'm doing a really wet on wet wash here, right? Yeah, actually just add a tad of that in there, because see how rich and dark that is now? Add more water, because I want to make it, keep it wet. Flick this up. Just keep it nice and wet. Should still have a nice little sheen to it. Notice here I've kept this, it did bleed down into this, but remember when we talked before about, I'm going to try and get a dark green here, and I'm going to see if I can do that with my cool tones. But no, you know what? Let's try that dark yellow with the, got polluted there. So here's a nice, there. It's a dull green, right? Remember, with the cool, with the warm, we'll make a duller, less intense. But this is a really nice evergreen color. It's not that it's a bad thing. It's just they all have their place, right? So there's that's a little bit more greener. And it's just, I'm just playing though. Don't get all. So this is where, you know, where you're in the play stage, right? I'm gonna kind of come in here again and go over this. See, the water is, the paper is still wet. It's not lifted. You can blend that out a little bit. So this is where you have a lot of working time with your wet on wet, right? Right, clean the. So I'm making a little bit more of a beautiful wintry kind of a blue. So I might even come in now. This is dry, it's not wet. I'm just going to kind of stroke that up. So I'm going to come into this wash, just kind of give it, kind of want this to kind of show that way, right? And then even, so I kind of like that. So what I'm going to do is I'll take that over even to this other side here and just pull up. Kind of, remember we were talking about working with your brush strokes and seeing what they can do for you? Well, this is that. This is what you're doing here. So we kind of got this really wet, wintry kind of a thing. The camera looks different than what the actual is too, so no worries. So I've kind of got two blues going on here, which is fine, right? I love ultramarine for sky, but winter is a little bit of a different sky too. It's kind of a gray blue, right? Because the sun is furthest away from us, and when the warmth is further away, we've got more cooler tones. So obviously in the winter time you are going to have cooler tones. So we can, you can play with this to bring that in a little bit. I kind of like sometimes a little bit of that white. It makes it feel like it's glowing. So also now too, with the winter, you're going to have almost like a bluey. So I'm really going to wet this one down. I'm going to really thin that out. And I'm just going to kind of come through like this, right? So this is just a really quick. Remember we talked about, and I'm gonna make it dark. I'm not gonna go any further with that, and I'm just gonna make it darker in here, because under the trees it's always darker, right? In that shadow part. And clean that up, and then just spread that out. Blend it. So that's the beauty of wet on wet. You work very quickly. And you get some really lovely effects. So it's not about picture or photorealistic. It's about interpretation, representational. So then you lift that off. Very, very wet. As you can see, the paper. This here is very wet, and there you are with a good wet on wet. Just a little bit of a fun exercise. Try that one. So that now is a wet on wet wash.